so happy to be here with you today. It's going to be a beauteous conversation full of depth and nuance that I hope to be cathartically expanding for you emotionally and also cognitively, and where I hope for us to keep on expanding this conversation further beyond the scope of this engagement, beyond the scope of this presentation, where we can act and live and think and do language as activists, as anti-colonial disruptors of the norm that is intrinsically colonial. So here we are. So that's the title of the presentation. It's called Language as Anti-Colonial Resistance and Creational Healing with me, Ches. And we're going to get to that in a second. What does it mean, right? But if I may interject right now, I want us to rethink language. Too often it's made out to be this oddly amorphous, neutral-looking thing, right? But when we look at it and investigate it with due critical mindedness, what we come to see is that language is being used to this day still institutionally with a very colonial and colonizing agenda that is not neutral, that is not innocent, that is not accidental, it's by design. And so what can we do as language speakers and also as coaches and profs, but just solely as agents of culture, agents of language, what can we do to actively disrupt that through anti-coloniality and anti-colonial resistance? So we're going to look into this today. And when you recognize the flaws in a system that is systemically institutionalized, when we can do that, you can undo the trauma, you can transcend it. And that's where you go from trauma to healing. And again, that's part of our mission today. So let's get started. This is going to be brilliant. Again, thank you so much for being here. And we're going to have a beautiful time. Now, to get us situated and oriented within the theoretical framework of it all, I broke it down for you structurally in those 3 core nuggets that we will be tackling, within a few minutes, actually. So the starting point, like I said, it's undoing the presumption of neutrality, meaning when we come into a space, when you think of language teaching, language learning, and language education, we operate within a very specific institutional paradigm that is colonial. But because it's systemic, and because that's the norm, and because it's part of our normal, we come to think and look at it as if it were normal. It is normal, but it's not neutral, right? And so how do we tell them apart? And how do we undo this presumption, this assumption that the system is neutral or neutralizing? And it speaks to how systemic and pervasive it is, right? That we're so conditioned by this learning environment, then we fail to pick up on the systemic flaws, the systemic deficiencies, the systemic privileges and underprivileges it perpetuates and promotes on a large scale. And that's where we come in. So we want to undo that, and we're going to break down the reality of the coloniality of our educational and institutional infrastructure so that as coaches, profs, and students, we know better how to react, how to respond, and how to disrupt and challenge that environment that is extremely systemic. Then from this, we're going to glide into the next nugget, which is coloniality as biological essentialism. And the mere thought or the conceptology that buttresses biological essentialism is something that I'm taking from my queerness. So we do that in queer studies and gender studies. In this context, it's looking at how cis heteronormative heteropatriarchy that is toxic and imposed is looked as its default, meaning when we think of gender spectrum in a very defective, binary-driven and restrictively binary. So reality, we think of genders as being a twofold, right? Men, woman, female and male, and everything else that does not find its full expression within those limitations is seen as an extra appendage that we have to slap onto that, but it's not normalized and it's always treated as outside of that centrality of gender reality. And when now we look at coloniality and racism and language, there's a lot of similar binary mentality that is reoccurring and that is institutionalized. Meaning, we're going to get back to it, but as a sneak peek, think of a native speaker. When you say native speaker, it's a term of exclusion and not of inclusion. That presupposes that there is a racial biology that is more dominant, that is more better, that is more legitimate than any other, that grants you a privilege in terms of status that other races won't be able to give you. So when we say native speaker, it's a very racialized spectrum of identities that get instantaneously recognized and validated and seen as more authoritative and more legitimate than any others. So we're going to get back to that. But this is where I'm creating this beautiful linkage between biological essentialism and coloniality. Again, this is part of the problematic of the system. Because those assumptions are so rampant, because they're not decorticated, they're not dissected enough, they're taken for granted and they're seen as part of the normal, as part of the system, as part of the neutrality. Whereas in fact, it's not neutral, it is colonial. And it is not inclusive, it is exclusive, right? And it's binary centered instead of being expansive, disruptive, and transdisciplinary. And so that's something we will look into. And last but not least, now that we have looked at the entirety of this systemic project, then the question is, okay, Ches, what do I do with this information? Why do I do with it? It seems bigger than I am. So what contribution can I strategically implement and leverage to be able to get us from the colonial into the anti-colonial, educational awareness and activism, where language becomes the implement of our choosing to get to that end. And so the last point is looking at what can we do actively as agent of change, agent of language and culture, as profs and students and teachers and coaches, as people that are part of the language industry. So what can we do actively to ensure the systemic decolonization of that supremacy that is perpetrated through language, through race, and through culture? And so that is what we're going to do, Like I said, don't worry, we're going to unpack every single item, but I wanted you to be able to visualize very clearly the trajectory from point A to B to point B to the end of this beautiful engagement. So this is us, right? And I'm all about creating connections between the conceptual and the practical so that we don't have all of this beauteous knowledge oozing about in our nuggets, but that we're really clear and keen on what we're going to do with that next in a way that makes the outcome inevitable and not optional, so that we can actively, positively, and strategically disrupt the system as we decolonize ourselves through it. So like I said, this is our structural breakdown. Now, before going any further, who am I? I think this is, the time to self-introduce and to get a sense of who I am. And I feel the best way to do this in a way that also reinforces the purpose and the structuring of this engagement is to self-introduce through 3 separate buckets of identity. And so I see academic, solopreneurship, and political activism as my 3 main go-to, most determining identities. And I'm going to explain them to you, right? So academic, I am an independent scholar doing research on anti-coloniality, and I'm creating this beautiful transdisciplinary research creation project. So I'm going to break it down to you right now. What is it? I'm doing my master's in translation studies, and I'm translating a play. So it's an oral text from my native indigenous language, which is Haitian Creole, into French and English. And I'm also sharing space through my translation with 2 other storytellers that are also racialized differently, who would be translating respectively from their own indigenous languages back into French and or English. And so how does that tie in a bit with the title and the purpose of us joining today? And how is that an exemplifier of my identity? Well, I came into a space that is very white dominated and very exclusive. And in my program, it's solely French, English, or English, French, and that's it. And I go, this is an insult to my spirit. This is not representative of true self-determined agency of the racialized, of the Queer, BIPOC, the queer, the trans, indigenous, Black, and people of color. So I go, what is my responsibility and my opportunity to create a change in the system that I'm part of so that I am empowered by my own education rather than disenfranchised by the systemic problematicity of that said education. And so I looked at the binary French English. You don't like it, then expand it. Make it about your own ancestry that is delegitimized, that is not academically recognized, that is not mainstream, that is ill perceived, that is demonized into racialization. I was like, great. So you're going to make it about Haitian Creole on that level. But what's the way that you can even push disruption further and make your self-determination an act of generous activism for other communities, right? So that's when I thought of reaching out to other racialized and indigenous storytellers so that we can create this beautiful transracial allyship network through the work that we do, so that we have different identities, the racialized, meaning the Blackness and the Indigenousness, and also the racialized, right? To have that experience conflated where we're each self-determinately autonomous in our own work. And we're also opening up the channels of sharing that power with other, influencers that are rooted in storytelling and indigeneity and race as core focus of their online work and scholarship and advocacy and in academia. So that's how I came to that point. And then you push it further. It's a beautiful project, but there's not enough of it. So how can you make sure that this becomes maybe instrumental in post-democratizing access and capacity for such projects to exist? And so we're going to share everything online, videos, make it very engaging, very visually driven, very accessible too, by breaking down the jargon to a level where more people will have access to the methodology, right? And so that's one way that we're breaking down different layers of language by making it more accessible and inclusive. And also looking at how it's white dominated and it's also text driven. So we went for oral languages that are not vindicated on par with, alphabet focused or alphabet driven one. And so I went for an alphabet free language or orally, articulated ones. And so that's one way that you use language, you disrupt it into bits and pieces, and then just as systemically, you're able to reverse engineer the focus on colonial experience and expertise into anti-colonial inclusion and resistance for the racialized that centers the queer, the trans, the Black, the Indigenous, and the people of color. So that's my project, doing my MA, and then you have my business. As a creative solopreneur, I am running this 2-tier coaching practice, language and creativity. Language is called the Creature of the Third Culture, and I help people that are part of the third culture, immigrant born and or adopted, relearn their lost Native Indigenous language and reclaim their biological ancestry. And on the other hand, you have the creativity coaching, where I help, artists create political art that matters for people who care, and I help them amplify their voices, create a more robust, strategic conversation around the political issues that they're tackling, and to become more self-sufficient in this very competitive universe through, for example, this transracial allyship network model that I propose. And in both instances, I am looking at ways to be creatively subversive and to develop your own autonomy in a system that is resistant to your agency by making yourself inevitably important in that space. And again, language is a big part of how I do that. And then last but not least, I have the DPP Hub. So I'm a co-founder of the Decolonial Perspectives and Practices Hub, aka the Hub or the DPP or the Decolonial Hub. So shout out to Alban, Koni, Hone, and Jamila, those beautiful souls. And what we do is political activism. We make it also very much rooted in language, the articulation of language, to recognize the privileges and the underprivileges within. And we help lots of organizations, people, individuals, universities, departments decolonize themselves so that they can become a beacon of a possibility model for inclusion on a much more radical scale, where again, we're centering the expertise, scholarship, and self-determination of the queer, Black, Indigenous, people of color. Yeah, so in a nutshell, that's how you see all those different pockets of me coexisting and feeding one another. So in the academia, you have, creating bleeding edge transdisciplinary scholarship that is, centering the reality, the expertise, and the lived experience knowledges of the queer, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And then I get to use that as a framework for my coaching practices and my language and creativity programming. And then you have the political activism, where you look at it from a bigger macro structural level, where we recognize the institutions that protect this very toxic coloniality driven ecosystem, and we help them decolonize themselves from the ground up. And so that's who I am and what I do and what brings me here. And in the same way that I did this MA looking at a lot of deficiencies I was able to recognize. I wanted to be here today to share and hold space with you and inclusion, to make you think of ways that you can become likewise your own possibility model that creates a safer and a more radically transparent and open space for anti-coloniality as the new normal that we all want to emulate. And so that's kind of why I wanted to share that. So when you see absence, you create presence. You see resistance, you see resistance, you create an alternative. And then you see coloniality, then you decolonize that through your own agency. And that's what brings me here today. Can't wait to hear more about you. So now onto the energetic commitment. So really quickly, I like to always kick it right off like this. So to know where you're coming from and who you are. And instead of asking how you're doing, because I feel it takes you outside of your own agency, makes it very about the externalities. Like, I know, it could be about your health or anything like this that's outside of your control that has a very determining influence on how you will feel. Whereas asking how do you choose to commit today? How do you choose to show up? Already roots you and grounds you into your own power and capacity to be the influencer on your own energies. And that's what I want to do with you. And so I will do it first. I invite you to do the same. And if you must, just hit pause, think it through, and then keep going. And so for me, it's the perfect trifecta. So 3 words / expressions that exemplify how I choose to commit today. And so I keep them pretty much consistently the same because they work that great for me. So I want to be powerful, connected, and grounded. I want this to be a beautiful, powerful moment where we become reflective and critical about the colonial realities that define how language is taught and disseminated, right? And then to find agency through that acknowledgement of what our reality is collectively and individually. I want us to be connected irrespective of the distancing. And I love that there is a paradox in that, being more connected, albeit physically removed. And last but not least, for us to be grounded in this conversation that I hope to be cathartic and expansive and revolutionary and beauteous for us all. And so that's my energetic commitment. So to be powerful, connected, and grounded. And so what's yours? Like I said, take a moment to think about it and let that inform how you will show up in the next minutes and how, you will commit to honoring our conversation today. So so that's a little energetic commitment to get us grounded. Now, I have this thing I call racial coloniality, right? So it's looking at race, colonialism, and language as this problematic trifecta. So like I said, we're going to dive right in, but you're going to dive right in, but when you think of, again, the native speakers, there are a lot of assumptions that have nothing to do with proficiency or fluency, but they have to do with the racialization of agency and legitimacy. So even for job applications, you apply, you can't check off the native speaker voice, the native speaker box, knowing full well that your raciality does not fit the expectation for how legitimate you are or you aren't, right? So there's that. And more specificity, let's look into this right now. So those are my nuggets. Okay, and don't worry, I'm going to unfold them in a second, but this is how I want us to be situated in terms of the logics of our conversation. I call this the colonial biology of racial exclusion. And what does it look like and what does it mean? We're going to look at the racialization of authority, legitimacy, and supremacy, and how this directly transfers into those specific examples, namely the native speakerism. As you can see, the ism is like racism, sexism. So it's a problematic that is embedded on a very core and institutional level in the conceptology of native speaker. And we'll break this down further into nativity versus fluency, the differences, accent versus pronunciation, some more differentiation, and last but not least, fluency and accuracy. So now, going back full mode, what do I mean by that? When you think of native speaker, the reality of that identity profile entails that you are born into an identity, into a culture, into a language, into privilege, and into legitimacy, which also just as determiningly infers that other people are born outside of that circle of legitimacy, authority, and supremacy. And so somebody like me, claiming to be natively fluent in XYZ language, would be termed and seen as a racialized and questionable person, laying such claims to something that is restrictively about the biology of the coloniality of that person. And that's how you create racial exclusion. When you think about it further, native speakerism is underdocumented academically and scientifically. And yet, it is one of the primest postulates that lots of linguistics, modern classics, and modern language theorists and specialists use to establish the rest of their methodology. And so when the premise is so flawed and under-investigated, and it promotes colonial realities and racial exclusion on such a deep level, we're dealing with a system that is not self-observant and critical to the point that it's addressing those issues. And so when we say native, what we're saying, you're born into something, a culture, a regime of authority. And then we make this very, let's say, pernicious inference that because you're born into this, you are fluent, whereas those are very different realities. Too often, being native means what? It would mean that you're born into this environment where there is this intense immersion, where culturally and linguistically you are primed and you're conditioned by that. But what it doesn't mean is that you are not, by so doing, being your most critically observant. You're not aware of all those mechanisms, even though you are internalizing a lot of mechanism, right? And so native speaker on that level is this unconscious conditioning that you are internalizing, but you're not being critically aware or self-aware of the flaws, the limitations, and the biases, and you're not actively, reflexively engaging language and culture. You're doing what you see, and it's very much performance driven. And so you're copying different forms of behavioralism through language and culture, but you're not actively, reflexively engaging and questioning that language. Fluency, on the other hand, I love because it's a skill that is acquirable, is not racializable. It is not a form of biological essentialism where we presume and infer certain privileges and authority based on your race and based on your presentation. So fluency, it's something that is scalable. There's a range. You have, let's say, you could put it on a scale of 1 to 3 or 5 or 10, and it's something that is observable, demonstrable, and scientifically substantiable, as opposed to nativity as an identity that elevates your status, grants you privileges, but is not something that can be argued for through scientific evidence, right? And so now when we look at fluency, what do we mean? I love to compare and contrast in this instance, so fluency and accuracy. Fluency is your capability to be able to seamlessly interweave different fragments and segments of thoughts and ideas into a very seamless sentence or whole. And so it's very much performance driven, right? And it's your capability to create a flow and the cadence of your speech, where we can see that there is an ease of going and coming from sentence to sentence, thought to thought. Whereas accuracy, it's very different. It's not performance driven. It's a passive, self-critical observational skill where what you're doing is you're capable of looking at the mathematicity behind the language. And so you recognize the mathematical aspect of grammar. You understand how the different elements that create the sentence, that create that iteration of speech, come together, and you're able to contemplate, investigate, and engage them very critically. And so those are very different skills that get conflated and absorbed into this idealization of what the native speaker is or isn't in ways that racially exclude and don't racially include, right? And so accuracy, it's just passive skills of having the distance and looking at it from up top, where you see the macro structure of language and you understand how to manipulate language critically. Fluency is on the level of your spontaneous capability to creatively engage language and to create and recreate different iterations and different capacities that exhibit ease and seamlessness in your doing. And then we have accent and pronunciation that are another subcategory, if you may, of that whole hierarchy, of that whole reality, that whole system. Accent, everybody has one. I call this your vocal DNA. It's how I know it's you. And part of that accent, it's also your passport in terms of geography. I can hear different influences, different dialects, right? So I can hear some of it at times. Accents will give you or take away privileges critically and uncritically, depending on how you're using language. And so certain accents are elevated because of the social politics and also the colonial reality of language. And pronunciation is different. It's looking at the scientific phonetics aspect of language, where you're told to pause and to stress different parts and parcels of what you're saying. And so one of them protects the sound system of the language. So that's what pronunciation does. It protects and recreates the sounds that are most congruent with that language. And so that's how I can tell French apart from Italian, from Spanish, from German, and so on and so forth. So that's owing to pronunciation. And within the same language, there exist different pronunciation models. So there's never just one, it's always a multiplicity. And so situationally, in certain regions, one received pronunciation model will, let's say, be more prevalent. And likewise, different accents would be more prominently foregrounded because those are the ones that are spoken by the elite. Those are the ones that give and take away privileges critically and uncritically, right? And so this is how you look at language from a macro level perspective, where you recognize how a lot of discourse that is rampant is ingrained and imbued with biologizing agencies by making so that you're seen as more or less legitimate than when you're born into something, even if the being born into it doesn't make you more critically aware, more proficient or fluent or even accurate. It's the presumption of that, right? And it gives you more privilege than other people. And so that's our starting point when we're looking at the systemic organization of language in terms of how it's seen, how it's perceived, how it's taught, and how is it learned by people. And let's say as a prof or as a student or as a teacher, what have you, you may have heard some variation of that, which is part of what I call the problematic colonial pedagogy. That word doesn't exist in whatever language. We don't see that in French. That is a mistake. That is broken English. That is not how we say. And the problematic of that and how it comes to be colonial, indeed, is how within one language, we look at it as a block that is monolithic and a norm that is restrictive. And we impose onto people to only speak that one variety, that one category, that one dialect. And we elevate that as we depreciate all others and as we erase all other alternatives. And that's colonizing the language, because we're not being critically observant. We're not being critically, culturally savvy or literate or neutral even in how we approach and tackle that specific language. So when I'm being told, and it's happened to me, oh, that word doesn't exist, It's like, how do you know? Language predates us by millennia and centuries. And you're telling me that for the whole length of time that that language has existed, you in your own mind are able to comprehend and to archive all the different iterations of words and the richness of the vocabulary and the evolution of grammar and the changes of grammar. No. And so saying it doesn't exist, it's a lack of humility. You could say it's the first time I've heard this, let me look it up, or I think what you meant was. And so to allow yourself to guide and to steer your students through with humility by acknowledging that it's possible they know something you don't, that you're not familiar with, and telling them how you would have said it rather instead, based on the stature of your own expertise, knowledge, and lived experience and engagement with the language as a critical thinker, moderator, and producer of that language. And again, saying we don't say, who's that exclusive we that makes their story, their lived experience irrelevant? And again, it's a very absolute statement where you are presupposing that you know everything and that no alternate or other way of saying it exists. And so instead, again, I've never heard of this before. It's very interesting. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Did you mean XYZ? And so prompting them with a question to further investigate that. And the idea that it's a mistake. It's not a mistake. It may be situationally inaccurate. If I am talking to a higher up and I use very obscene vocabulary, it was not a mistake. It was strategic miscalculation, because language is communication, and great communication is strategic and effective and targeted, meaning I know who I'm talking to, so I can calibrate my speech to be able to speak to them on a level where the maximum understanding would be created. And so it's not a mistake. Maybe it's on-strategic miscalculation. If I'm talking informally to somebody in a very formal context, that means that I miscalibrated and miscalculated, and there's still opportunity to work from that. Saying something is broken or not, again, it's creating this supremacy, this hierarchy, this better colonial way of doing language by reasserting in a very exclusive norm rather than recognizing that there are different registers of language. And again, the question is, was I being strategically most effective in my chosen form of communication? Question mark. And the answer to that can be no, and that's okay, and that's perfect, because now we have something to work off of. But from that to say that it's broken, that it's a mistake, that it doesn't exist, we're not using this very absolutistic and problematic and exclusive language and vocabulary and attitude as we are in a position to teach, to share, to include, and to elevate and educate. Right. And so again, not using this exclusively, not blatantly and flagrantly just saying no to the possibility of not knowing everything about the language or a culture, right? And so those are ways that we can destabilize the problematic colonial pedagogies that are too rampant and that are very much part of the reason why a lot of people have lived through trauma in language, because they're being called out like this in forms of public humiliation with no support in terms of how to redress the mistakes that may have occurred in speech. And yeah, so it's very corrective. It's aggressively punitive and corrective system where we impose one colonial norm and we pretend that the others are invalid or illegitimate. And that's how we drill language into people from a very institutional level. And that's problematic. And so the ways that I gave you are micro reframings that you can use instead of what is on the slide right now, so that when you're in a position where you can help somebody understand something, just go from, hey, never heard that before. What did you mean? There's another way to say that. If you want to be more strategically accurate, you could say X, Y, Z. So to refine, and to be more critical about how we say what we say and how we teach people that is a beautiful way also to decolonize our own pedagogy. Now, there's an exercise I love doing. I see time is running by, and I call this the debunking of structural colonial elitistic paradigm. So basically, it's unfortunately in the language industry, you hear a lot of that language is easier than, it's more difficult than, or it's easier for children to learn, it's more difficult for adults, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of unchecked, unchallenged, problematic postulates that create different categories of people who are more or less disadvantaged because of biology, race, age, or other circumstances. And a lot of people buy into that ecosystem, and then they create whole paradigms that justify that, whereas in fact it's not accurate. And I am a strong disbeliever of all of the above. So I'm going to get to that in a second. After that, we want to look at de-hierarchizing legitimacy, authority, and power. What does it mean? It means that instead of having different accents, different pronunciation, different races that are in different models of native speakers that are more valid or less valid then, right? So instead of creating that hierarchy or that supremacy, what we want to do is to complexify it into a horizontal spectrum. Everybody is equal in their own divergence, and we're not competing for linguistic or cultural relevance or supremacy. We're all uniquely who we are in the most assertively self-determined of ways. And as we do so, we move from cultural and linguistic supremacy into cultural and linguistic neutrality and relativism, where it's not a competition. We recognize that each language is equally sophisticated as the next, and that they're not to be made more or less than in a very binary comparative model. And instead of going, this is wrong or this is better, recognizing how each language, right, is situationally accurate and how each dialect and each register is situationally accurate. Again, if the point of communication is to be strategic and to be able to relay across most effectively what is on your mind, there are ways that you can develop strategies around it to get your point across faster and better. And that's what I call situational accuracy. And when you do all of the above and some different variations, right, on the micro level, that then turns into a macro impact. What you're doing is that you're undoing the supremacy of language, culture, and race, and you're allowing all of us to live from our highest purpose and integrity through the third culture. And the third culture is there's no racial, cultural, linguistic dominance or supremacy. It's allowing ourselves to be transcultural instead of monocultural in a way that re-racializes access. So we don't pretend that there is not such a thing as race, but we prevent and are very adamant about is not making race, let's say, the way that we secure, grant, or refuse access into legitimacy. And so when you do that, you challenge the state, the colonial multi-state, and you break those colonial and elitistic paradigms, right? And so like I was saying, people tell me it's easier for kids. When you think of kids and adults learning, the expectations of fluency for a kid are not that of an adult. An adult can speak very easily like a kid, but is that the expectation that we want to set for them? And the strategies and the way that a child learns is not the way that an adult learns. So if we try to teach adults with children's tools, then guess what is going to happen? It won't work. And that's one area of problematicity. Adult conversation entails a lot of more conceptually evolved paradigms and vocabulary and language. And so the way that we approach that level of teaching needs to be radically different from, the way that the children are conditioned into their own learning. And so that's one way that, to me, that doesn't make any sense too. And also from the perspective of neuroplasticity, neurosciences, and all that stuff. And so that was one way that we debunk structural elitistic paradigms, because it gives the idea that one category of people is biologically and racially more entitled to fluency than others is not just inaccurate. Or I had other people tell me, hey, Chesline, I've been trying to learn XYZ language for XYZ time. It's not working. It's so hard. And then I tell them, it's not about the quantity of time, it's the quality of time. Do you have a systemic set of strategies that are tailored to your learning model that makes, and the question is no, a lot of the time. And so you can spend 10 hours doing something, but if you're using the wrong tools, then you're not going to get anywhere with that. And so it's a systemic, strategic approach to the systemic change that you want to see in your life. So 15 minutes that are well managed are more impactful than 1 hour or 10 hours that are mismanaged. And so that's another way that you can debunk lots of assumptions and presumptions regarding language that create those artificial categories of it's easier than, it's better than, then that get recycled into the colonial model and into the cultural linguistic supremacy model. Yeah. So that's in a nutshell what I meant for us to look into. And so, like, really quickly, okay, Shes, what do we do from there? It's all beautiful information, but then what do we do with that, right? And so, what I would say is one of the following. When you think of your paradigms, meaning your references, your standards, re-racialize them. So if you see they're extremely white dominated, and integrate other form of representations that disrupt and challenge you as being the center of the norm for your cultural linguistic universe. If you teach using different audio clips and materials that represent a very elevated, racially diverse and inclusive spectrum of speakers and of people who carry legitimacy and authority in that language. So different accents, different pronunciation models, and also embed that with other realities. For example, think of ways to queer the language that you use. Do you have references for them in English and French and whatever language you're teaching? And so you make it heterogeneous. So it's not the monolith. It's not this uniform, artificially uniform way of looking at the culture, right? Also play the gamut, the registers. So show the register of language, how you can go from polite to impolite, how it's not a monolith again, and how all those ways of speaking are valid and they're just differently accurate. If I speak formally to a friend, it can be registered as being just this kind of dissonance, right? It's not the best in terms of situational accuracy. And so to be aware of that, to complexify language, acknowledge that language is not neutral, that there are politics at play, and lots of those politics are race driven and informed. And also affirm self-representation and determination by not always being the mouthpiece for diversity and inclusion. Be an ally. Sponsor people who do work, anti-colonial work, invite them over, support their work, promote them, have them as a guest invited to your class, to your sessions with your students, help post democratize their own visibility. So you're not always a person speaking from other people's agencies, but you aren't just facilitating access, right? So removing yourself from centrality, but involving yourself in the anti-coloniality of change. And yeah, likewise, some questions I get asked, I don't know where to start. Like I said, start small, micro-focused action, or better than overwhelmingly big, diffuse, and unfocused action. So start with one thing you can pick from today. Teach, for example, your students about accent versus pronunciation, fluency and accuracy, debunking native speakerism. Have people come over to your courses and educate you as much as your students about better ways to re-racialize, the colonial reality to make it anti-colonially, magnificent and inclusive, and about transracial allyship. So that's one way. So keep it small, consistent, and when you see that you mastered that element, then just evolve from there. And that kind of answers the second one. And what you can do is promote the work of people doing that, get informed, use one piece that would be part of your methodology that you're changing, and then just keep going from there. And so last but not least, it's now that we've had that talk, I want you to commit. So as everything that you are, think of what you will do actively to remain committed to disrupting the coloniality. And like I said, go small, but stay consistent, and you will have the micro impact that you so desire. And think also about your energetic commitment. How do you choose to show up? For me, at this point, it's unapologetic, life-given, and driven in what I do. And also thinking of the beginning, it's powerful, connected, and grounded, right? And so last but not least, think of how you can use language to address trauma and to create anti-colonial healing. So people like me who've gone through the system and being delegitimized because of race and other circumstances, how did we use the trauma to create healing, like I do through my translation project, for example? And I give you example, maybe relearning your own lost Native Indigenous language is one way that you create healing in the face of institutional trauma, or helping people who are doing actively that journey and learn from their experience and then see how you can fit that into what you're already doing. Then promote racialized languages, oral languages, and indigenous languages as well. So be an ally, be a sponsor, and don't make it about you being the central force for that, but you can be a lateral. So let people take the stage, educate you when it's necessary, and then you can share space and authority together. So yeah, okay, so this is it. Sorry it took a few more minutes of your time, and I want this to remain like an active conversation between us all. So I give you all my information so we stay connected. I saw a lot of people are very quick to react on Instagram, so that's one space we can see more of each other and share the work that we do to keep this conversation alive and thriving. And so this is it, folks. This is it from me, for us, for today. And like I said, I wanted to make sure that I keep it very action driven and lots of examples, so that's not all macro conceptually maddening, but also illuminating, and then you can see where you fit into all of that. So I thank you, I honor you, I appreciate you, and I'm glad to be walking together with you in transracial allyship and a commitment to destabilizing the institutions that we're in that colonize language, right? So I'm happy that we come together and that we honor the journey of the anti-colonially resistant, self-accomplished, and self-determined today. So talk later, beautiful day to you. Mwah.